So I think we'll go ahead and start, and we'll wait for the rest of the attendees to join us. We have some introductions. I just want to say good morning. My name is Lauren MacLean, and I'm a professor of comparative politics. And I usually co-teach the IQMR module on fieldwork methods with Diana Kapachevsky. Currently, I'm also department chair at Indiana University. So in addition to fieldwork, I'm thinking a lot about the price of plexiglass and how to get hand sanitizer, things that I wasn't imagining ever having to think about. But I'd like to welcome everyone to this little bit of IQMR. I think we would have all preferred to be in person for the full-fledged institute that usually takes place in June at Syracuse University, but we're really grateful to all of our panelists today, the organizers, and especially you for coming to participate in this webinar series. The series includes a whole variety of panels that are under this big theme of adapting qualitative and multi-method research for COVID-19. So, of course, we'd like to thank the Moynihan Institute of Global Affairs in the Maxwell School of Syracuse for supporting this series. We also want to thank Christiane Page and Yuri Yu from the Center for Qualitative and Multi-Method Inquiry for helping to organize and helping us pull off this webinar format. I also want to thank Nabila Rahman, my PhD student from IU, who will be our fabulous Q&A moderator, and herself has recently returned from fieldwork that she was doing on a Fulbright in India. So our panel today is titled Conducting Fieldwork Under COVID Constraints, Interpretive Approaches and Ethnography. Many of us were planning fieldwork this spring or summer, or perhaps this coming year, and we're no longer able to do that fieldwork in the same way. So we may not be able to travel at all to the place that we were doing this work, or even if we live next door to our field sites, it might not be safe or ethical or wise to proceed with the fieldwork in the way that we had imagined. Our panelists will be helping us to think through not only what doors have been closed, but what might still be possible, and even trying to think innovatively about something new that perhaps we hadn't thought about. We'll be thinking reflexively through an interpretive lens about how these changes change our relationships in the field with our participants and how we may approach research. Thoughts. We'll proceed in alphabetical order with Jack Corbett from the University of Southampton in the UK. And then Diana Kim from Georgetown University in the US. And next, Robin Turner from Butler University, right here in Indianapolis, Indiana, where I sit. We are trying to have a little more informal vibe for this webinar. So each of our panelists will be making their own introductions, telling us a little bit about themselves, and what they think is important for you to know about who they are. So I'll be serving primarily as a discussant and chair for the discussion, but I do have one story I want to share and a few thoughts from my own disrupted fieldwork that I'll add after the three panelists before we go to our Q&A. So just a few reminders. The presentations will last 45 minutes to an hour. Then we'll have a Q&A session, so we'll have at least a half hour for Q&A. Because this is a webinar, to ask a question, you hover your cursor over the lower part of your screen and click on the Q&A box. You can type your questions at any time during the presentation. If it's directed at a particular panelist and you really want them to respond, you can preface the question with their name, so who you are really interested in hearing from. If you are participating and you see a question that's already been posed and you really think that's a great question and you want to sort of put some weight to it, If you like it, that will raise the question up in the queue. So that's kind of cool. The questions will be combined, moderated by Nabila, and we'll hopefully have a lively discussion. One reminder, the whole event is being broadcast and it's being recorded so that this can hopefully be shared with a broader audience. So just so you know that this will be recorded and the link will be posted on the IQMR website page. So I think without more from me, we will get to the fun parts and begin with our first panelist, Jack. Can you take it away, Jack?
Okay, I think I've unmuted. Let me try and share my screen. Can everyone see that? I will, oops. Slideshow. Righto. Thank you, Lauren. So my name's Jack Corbett. I'm Professor of Physics at Southampton in the south. Okay, funnily enough. What do? I teach research methods, both for our School of Social Science, but also for the National Centre of Research Methods in the UK, which I guess is sort of broadly analogous to IQMR. And I also substantively teach democratization, a course on democratization and political leadership. My research predominantly has been focused on small island developing states, first in the Pacific and these days more in Europe and the Caribbean. And I've also done a little bit of work on foreign aid. I guess the other thing to say about me is you can probably tell from my accent that you may not be able to tell, but I'm Australian. So I hope you can all understand me. I did my PhD at the Australian National University, and actually I attended IQMR in 2015 as an early career scholar, and actually did Lauren's fieldwork course while I was there. So it's a bit of a surreal moment to be now on a panel talking about these same issues. So this was going to be my first year teaching at IQMR, and I was going to teach a book along with two colleagues, John Boswell and Rhodes, called The Art and Craft of Comparison, which was a book, or is a book, about how to do comparative interpretive research. So in thinking about what to talk about today, I basically thought that I would take some of the ideas that I think might be relevant to this question of trying to do interpretive research under COVID constraints from the book. And also, I guess I was trying to think, well, what would be useful if I put myself back in my PhD scholar shoes? What would I wanted to know about doing this type of research in the current environment? I mean, I'm trying to do research at the moment myself. I'm facing some of the challenges that I suspect many of you are facing, and I'll talk a little bit about how I'm trying to work through those. But I think the PhD is a particular thing, and there are unique challenges that go with that. In fact, when I was thinking about what advice I would give myself as a PhD student, I wasn't exactly sure that I would be. I think if I was going through what you're all going through, I'd be sitting in the corner with a paper bag, sort of hyperventilating. So I think the first thing really to say is that it's incredible that you're here, you're still going, you still want to finish the PhD. I think it's just amazing. But this is really, so I guess to reiterate that, these are really challenging times. I'm going to try from the book to draw out some tips and tricks, if you like, that may be useful, that may be able to help see this or see some of the opportunities that might be able to come of this. But I don't think that in any way should detract from how extra difficult this is for all of us, but particularly those of you doing the PhD. In fact, I suspect, I don't know, I sort of sit there, particularly at the moment with my fieldwork on hold, and I think, gee, I wish I could do quantitative research right now, right? I could just sort of sit in my office and run some regressions, and it would be much, much easier. And maybe you're thinking that too. Maybe you're sitting there thinking, gee, I wish I hadn't decided to do qualitative fieldwork. I hope what I can impress upon you today is not necessarily that there's some kind of cliche pep talk, but there are aspects of qualitative research that are going to be really hard to do right now, but there are some things about it, particularly with an interpretive lens, that might be suitable to this type of environment, and particularly the emphasis that we often place in this type of research on creativity and adaptability and flexibility, all of which are a normal part of our research practice, but hopefully will stand us in good stead in this kind of moment. The first is kind of to just give you a quick reminder of the difference between these different logics to research. This is very stylized. I'm not sure I'm a huge fan of the two schools approach, but I think it serves as a heuristic for this type of discussion. I guess the part I want to draw your attention to the most is just the orientation. So the first line in this table. So on one hand, we have a logic of justification. And actually, so on one hand, people working in this type of tradition, if they're particularly just using quantitative analysis and they don't need to do any of their own survey work or whatever, yes, they might find, have things a bit easier in this particular moment. But I think if you are working in that type of tradition and you are having to collect your own type of data, whether it's survey data or some other type of data, the fact that a logic of justification in a sense locks you into a set of hypotheses and a particular research design can actually mean that you are less flexible when it comes to changing your research in minor or more dramatic ways given the circumstances that we're in. Whereas if you're working from the more interpretive standpoint, which tends to operate more in a logic of discovery, you start with a puzzle, aiming to tell a narrative. Your explanation takes a narrative form. You actually have more flexibility built into that type of approach. In fact, one of the reasons we go to the field is we expect to be surprised and we expect to learn new things, and we expect it to throw up challenges which are going to help us to understand the phenomenon that we're studying. So in a sense, this is sort of what we do, albeit this is a more extreme version, if you like. The other point I want to make here is in an interpretive mode, there's not necessarily there certainly isn't a perfect way to do research or a perfect way to collect data, and there's no necessary linear timeline for the way that you collect data and write up your research. So we often think about research in terms of you read the literature, you generate your hypothesis, you collect your data, you do your analysis, you write up your findings. But in interpretive research, we talk about this idea of abduction, which tends to mean that desk work and field work are combined, and we move back and forth between these different aspects of our research. And I think in the current environment, that type of sensibility can actually be useful. We don't have to put our research on hold just because we can't get to the field sites that we would normally get to. We can work on other aspects of our project, and that's all tying together, or all can be tied together in the end. So the term we use in the book to describe this is bricolage, or we think of ourselves as bricoleurs. So the little extract I've got there is we're philosophically committed to using whatever data is suitable for the study, mixing and matching different forms of data to tell a story in the most arresting, evocative, and interesting way. So there's no ideal way to do fieldwork, no essential data to collect. We're trying to create a narrative. And that narrative can be, or primarily in an interpretive idiom, you're interested in first-person accounts, you're interested in interviews and observation and these type forms of data, but there are plenty of other ways to collect material that may be relevant to your puzzle. And other panelists are going to talk, I think, more about them in depth, but certainly at the moment with my projects that I'll talk about a bit more in a second, I'm using more archival material, I'm using I'm using more autobiographies and biographies. I'm tapping into online sources. I'm doing more with secondary sources than I perhaps would have. All of these are different ways that we can collect data and use data as bricoleurs. So the book itself is split up into different chapters that deal with different rules of thumb, if you like. I guess one of the things about interpretive research is there is no necessary, as I said, there's no linear pathway that you can follow, which makes writing a methods book about interpretive research perhaps a little bit ironic. But what we tried to do is provide some tips and tricks, if you like, some practical wisdom on the basis of those of us who've done it and tried and failed in many cases. So I picked out a couple of the rules of thumb that from our chapter on fieldwork that I thought we're talking about today. And the first thing we write about in the book is about being pragmatic and opportunistic. Actually, when we wrote about this, we were primarily talking about time and money. Those were our major logistical constraints that we were talking about. But I think it still works in the current environment. Obviously, pragmatically, there's a greater imperative we have to place on our health and making sure that we're not putting ourselves in situations that might be dangerous. But the pragmatism and optimism that comes with doing this type of research, I think, can lead us to try and use different forms of data. So I'll give you two examples from my own projects. One, my PhD, and the other, the project I'm working on at the moment. So the dissertation, I was working on politicians in the Pacific Islands. I did life history interviews, but I also used autobiographies and biographies, which were a source that was readily available from the library. And then as an interview. So I could ask the same questions that I was asking in an interview setting, but I could ask them of a text. So I was able to publish out of that material. I still collect that type of material. And in fact, I did an edited book in the end on the use of that type of material in this sort of way. So that was an opportunistic move on my behalf. I didn't really think about using that type of data previously, but it was a way of using material that was readily available to me from the library that I could, the same types of questions, but without having to go to the field. Of mediums that I was able to pick up and intersperse. In the end, work became another subject. That was something I was presented before going to the field. So that's one example. So I'm working on a book at the moment. I'd got halfway through my field research when COVID came along. So I was hoping, I'm on research leave at the moment. I was hoping to do all of that research over the last couple of months, but was unable to, had to put that on pause. But what I have been able to do is spend more time doing reading secondary literature that I would have wanted to get around to, but wasn't able to. I've been able to do more archival work. I actually collected a lot of archival work, which I thought would be peripheral, but now it's become more central. So these are sort of ways that I think we can be pragmatic and opportunistic in the way that we approach our fieldwork. That leads me to my second point, which is the other thing I've been doing and which I did in the PhD is, and this is maybe slightly irreal, but it's something that we recommend in the book, is that when we're doing interpretive research and we're using this abductive logic, we can actually start writing straight away. We don't have to wait until we've got all of our data collected. We're trying to tell a narrative story about that sheds light on a research puzzle, and so that story is always evolving. We're always changing the story to make sense of our data, but actually writing allows us to do that sense making. So in the PhD, I was going back and forth between different countries, and when I was at home, I would just start writing, and then I'd collect some more, and then I'd write, and I'd rewrite, and I'd rewrite, and I'd rewrite, and that's the beauty of the modern word processor. You can keep writing over what you've written, and certainly that's what I've been doing in the last few months with the current book project. I've just been writing I'll have to go back and fill in some of the gaps. But actually the beauty of writing straight away is that you know where the gaps are, that some of that crystallizes in your mind when you write. And so then the final point I want to make, and I guess I'll stop here after this one, is that we talk about field work and ethnographic field work, and we borrow this idea from sort of the fringes of anthropology that we can also, that while the main idea or the main norm we have in our mind when we think about ethnography is we go for an extended soak, 6 months or more in a particular place. But also we can do what we call, or what some ethnographers call, yo-yo ethnography, where we move in and out of different field sites. And I suspect that many of you are being moved in and out of field sites at the moment. And this is disruptive and it's annoying, and you probably wish you could be just back and finishing off your research. Or maybe you're planning to go to the field but worried that you're going to be called back from time to time. And I think what we would argue is that yo-yoing, even though it's often seen as a second best solution, that it can actually be beneficial for the way that we do this type of research. Intense bursts of field work and then some time away from the field to reflect, to do some writing, to supplement our qualitative primary sources with other types of sources that I've just spoken about, can actually be beneficial, and in some ways it can help to improve and refine our analysis. So I think I've probably taken my time. I'm really sorry about the technical problems.
This is the life we live.
Yeah, indeed. Really looking forward to the other presentations and to answering any questions later on.
So thank you, Jack. Really appreciate that. And it really is great to see colleagues that I've met for the first time at IQMR, and then to see them later participating as faculty at IQMR or different conferences. So, and I think it is important to recognize that this moment is difficult for all, but it's especially difficult for PhD students. So I like the way that you preface some of your remarks with that. But really also to think about how an interpretive approach, just the very sort of built-in adaptability and flexibility encourages innovating. It doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean it would be your first choice. But the way that we can think about sort of writing and analyzing and thinking creatively about the kinds of sources that may become more central to our projects in the current moment. So I really appreciate that. I want to turn now to Diana Kim.
Shall I go ahead? Hi, I am Diana Kim. I'm an assistant professor at Georgetown University in the School of Foreign Service. And I had my PhD in political science from the University of Chicago and did a postdoctoral prize fellowship in econ, history, and politics at Harvard University before joining the faculty at Georgetown. My work lies at the intersection of comparative politics and IR, focusing a lot on histories of empire, colonial state formation, and their legacies today, looking mostly at Southeast Asia, but branching out a bit transnationally. And my first book has just come out with Princeton University Press, and it's entitled Empires of Vice, and it's on the rise of opium prohibition across Southeast Asia since the 19th century. This would have been my first year teaching at IQMR as well. I would have been with the two different modules, one co-taught with Dara Grant on interpretive methods and discourse-related research, and the second one with Lauren and Diana Kapachewski and Jen Sayre on fieldwork, focusing especially on archives. Most of my research is archivally based, multi-site archives. I use the ones in Europe, especially Britain, France, and then across Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Cambodia, Vietnam for my first book. And a lot of my work is in the sort of CHA tradition, but being kind of mindful to the interpretive nature of a lot of the social phenomena that we look at. So what I wanted to do was to sort of reflect on what for me is the most immediate disruption and the disruption that I've seen most common among the students that I have, which is the issue of access, especially relating to archives. It's a quite personal issue for me as well that's been weighing heavily on my own research. I had 6 months of archives planned for the spring semester in Japan and Korea for my second project, which was supposed to include collecting oral histories from marginalized communities in Korea and Japan, using their national archives, national libraries, as well as local repositories. And so I can imagine something that was incredibly stressful, disorienting, and confusing for me is all the more so for students who are at the PhD stage and thinking about the dissertation going forward. And it happens whether it's at the very exploratory stage or whether you're at the stage of writing up. So I wanted to reflect a bit on how I myself have been trying to make sense of this situation, which for lack of a better description, I think is just archives interrupted, and offer a few suggestions on ways that I've been navigating the situation that I hope might speak to your experiences. One thing that I found not terribly comforting, but anchoring was a sense that we're living in a quite extraordinary moment of a very long crisis, at least for 6 months. But this disruption of access itself is not something that's totally new or unusual. Archives have been interrupted in the past, indefinitely, with different clouds of uncertainty, with the records being annihilated, reclassified, relocated. Some of my work, past work, looked at Cambodia, and there the National Archives and Libraries had been shut down for 4 years when the Khmer Rouge took over Phnom Penh. And what happened to the libraries was the gardens and some of the rooms were being given over to pigs and cattle in order to house livestock. And so you saw the total destruction of a lot of the records, and also denied access, of course, for researchers. So the political situation and the kind of experiences for researchers go along hand in hand. And of course, there are so many more kind of instances of this type of disruption during World War II in different archives. So that's been kind of helpful to think about, but it also makes me mindful of what is different about our present moment, beyond the sort of very personal nature of how psychologically disorienting the suddenness of our cutoff from the physical access to archives are. And what I think is quite different right now than it was from the past is the technology aspect. So the availability of digitized records and sources is something that is, I think, to echo Jack's language earlier before, both an incredible opportunity through which we can kind of navigate this moment of rupture, but it's also at the same time with risks of being disorienting, partly because it's so abundant. So I want to talk through 3 ways that I've been working through the digitized aspects of online archives, which really starts from a recognition that there is no singular or definitive piece of advice or way to approach online archives, not only because our research questions are also different, but because the way that archives are housed and they're digitized are so decentralized. So to try to presume that there is a kind of general logic that we can follow, I think is quite distracting. And so everyone's experiences will be slightly different and always piecemeal in nature. So that caveat. One suggestion that I have relates to how to tame digital archives and how do you approximate the physical experience of being in an archive. So right now, one thing I find super interesting is since February and March, we've had a sort of explosion of available digital archives, free and open access sources temporarily, which is incredibly exciting And also, I don't know if many students end up doing the same thing that I do. I end up clicking between different websites and finding hyperlinks going back and forth, to the extent that I've seen 7 different archives and haven't really been able to collect anything just because I'm browsing so quickly. So that is something that I think is a distraction and can be kind of unsettling when using the online repositories. Another kind of pitfall to the pure online and virtual experience of archival research right now is that we sort of lose a recognition of the very profoundly human nature of the archives themselves. They're more than just repositories for documents, but arguably living spaces. What the French historian Arlette Farge regarding the French police archives said, they're places where records will breathe and where scholars will come to discover meaning from documents, from fragments of paper, which themselves may be fragments of a past time that we enjoy, we struggle with, and we find research questions and puzzles from them. The archives are also, as the Haitian historian Michel Routrouillot recognized, as institutions that are organizing facts and sources, and the ways that they're housed, the experiences of the archivists there, and our encounters with different scholars will shape the ways in which by forced nature at the moment, the purely online and virtual nature of archival research that a lot of us are forced to do. And one way to address this, to my mind, is to make use of research guides. I realize this is kind of an anticlimactic solution to what is a very big problem, but let me just give you a brief look at what I mean by the research guides. So those of you who have done archival research before or have browsed around will be familiar with these types of records. So often they're booklets or they're websites more recently. This is an old one from the Colonial archives for Vietnam that are housed in Center 1 in Hanoi. So it's a guide. It's usually compiled by the archivist, past archivists of a different repository. And they explain various aspects of the archive's history, which is fascinating in and of itself. But they'll also include the lists of the different sources that are there. So this particular one is 300 pages, takes a lot of time to browse through. But what it's helpful for is it helps you understand the certain structure and the architecture of the different documents, which are rarely done chronologically, of course, rarely done alphabetically or in any near order, but often follow the sequence in which they're collected by an archive. So traditionally, these types of guides have been helpful for figuring out, once you're in the archive, where a certain source is, how to get the right call number, and how to summon the record. What we rely on now, and I think I find this guide a really exemplary template from the National Archives of the UK in Kew, are summaries that are made by the staff and the specialists of specific areas that explain the holdings of the archive. So for instance, this is just a research guide on women's suffrage. It explains both what the collection entails, what kind of records and periods the archive holdings have. And it also summarizes what can be viewed online, like the suffragette collections, the arrest records. They often include summaries and statistics on treatment of women in prisons, anything that relates to the topic of the early 20th century suffrage movement. You get examples of different types of documents. And one thing that is, I think, especially helpful is they will often include general tips on how to use a catalog for records. So specific keywords, like if our inclination is to use certain keywords as suffrage movement, activism, it could be that the relevant keywords are different. So non-militant campaigners is the name that's being used more often during the 20th century. To the extent that, especially for those who are planning to newly explore the archives and have that type of access disrupted, understanding what the viewpoint of the archivists and the people at the archives can be super helpful for more efficiently and more effectively compiling and exploring what are millions and millions of documents at different repositories. So this is especially well done research guide for my own topic of Southeast Asia and late 19th, early 20th century Southeast Asia. There are smaller ones, usually shared among researchers. And these are, I think, incredibly useful ways to start navigating the digitized sources that are out there. So rather than plunging in and typing in keywords, taking a step back to look at the research guides available is also a way to kind of build on the existing scholarship and figuring out what's where and why. Just very briefly, a second type of online record that I found, this is more of a compilation that I found super helpful, is this open and free access materials for research website compiled by the Institute of Historical Research. So I'm sure many of you have encountered this, and I'd be actually curious to raise it during Q&A. But I've been on Twitter a lot since COVID interrupted research, just to start collecting information sharing among historians about which archives have been open at this moment. And there have been individual historians, individual political scientists and researchers who are kindly making their sources temporarily available. What the IHR did really beautifully is create this website that gives a sort of list of currently and updated online archives. So this one from Oxford, these from the International Council of Archives, the Endangered Archives Programs has one. So what's amazing about this is they give you a summary of everything that they've been able to find that are being shared on through institutions, through Twitter, through shared Google spreadsheets, which is a lot of way that scholars are exchanging what they know is available now. Some include just hashtags for a specific person's Twitter handle and the Google Doc that they're sharing. So this is, I found a really good way to navigate through the abundance. And then for general sources, bibliographies, they've organized them by different time periods. And given the sort of historical turn and archival turn of a lot of political scientists, I imagine this resource could be useful as well. Okay. So that's one kind of general suggestion, taming the digital abundance using research guides. Second one is about navigating networks of privilege and economies of sharing. One thing to be mindful of is those who have very specific files or call records that they're searching for, but your access has been denied. There are a lot of groups clustered by different sub-themes. So Southeast Asia, studies of Burma, where scholars are offering to share the different images that they've collected in the past and disclosing them. One is that I've seen especially, I apologize. Sorry. One is a research group called the Archive Record Sharing Group from the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations. These types of groups, if you have a specific document that you don't have, but you've seen another scholar use, or you've seen cited in a different history, it's a good way to connect to those people directly and ask if they'd be willing to share them. I think given the extraordinary nature of our circumstances, a lot of people are mindful that students need extra pushes, and these are good moments to ask people to be more generous. I've been asked by a lot of students to share copied records that I have on opium regulation in Southeast Asia, as well as taxation records. I'm very inclined to share them, and I'm more than happy to talk during the Q&A about specific ways to ask for these types of data sharing on an interpersonal level. And just on the last note, as I think I'm at time, I want to echo one point that Jacques made about the need and importance of returning to our secondary sources. For me, it felt frustrating at first to be told, yeah, go back to the books that you read and the history books. But now that I think more carefully through it, what that entails is just, in a way, a switching of the sequence through which we often do research. Usually, and Diana Kapczewski has written about this beautifully in her Fieldwork book, but we often tag back and forth between looking for new sources, trying to contextualize them, collecting a bit more. So there's always this feedback loop and tagging back and forth. What the rupture and disruption of access has done, it's forced us to be a bit more rigid in thinking more about our secondary sources. What are the historical monographs that we're reading? What are the main kind of sources that we look at, or articles and books that we think of for collecting facts, understanding why they're facts, with the idea that eventually at some point down the road, we'll be able to find the primary records or rethink the necessity of the primary records that we have. And so in that case, I would echo really returning to the secondary sources that you've accessed during fieldwork, that you've had recommended from other colleagues, to rethink what is the existing knowledge that you're trying to build on. And that, I think, provides the groundwork, and it saves time down the road during write-up. We end up, I'll conclude on this note, I ended up having to go back to a 1972 book on the politics of heroin in Southeast Asia, which is a classic in my particular realm. I read it during my first year of grad school. I read it during my third year during my dissertation proposal stage. And I read it again during my 7th year when I was writing up. And I realized it looked like such a different book. And my way of framing my question had shifted a great deal. So in a way, it's helpful to think of yourself as doing that work in ahead at a time when your access is interrupted. I'm happy to chat more during the Q&A, and yes, thanks.
Thank you so much, Diana. I want to remind all of our participants to please add questions to the Q&A. You're welcome to put those questions in all during the presentations as you're sort of being provoked and stimulated to think about new issues or things that you would hope that we discuss. So please do think about the questions. Diana, that was really helpful to think about sort of that this is not just removal of access, that there's also this expansion of access, but how do you sort of attend to and think about managing this abundance as well. So I hope we'll have further discussions about that, and then what is lost by not physically being there. And also really want to encourage students to follow up on those suggestions about individual connections with scholars. This is a really important time. And I think at this particular moment, people may be more open to connecting with junior scholars and hopefully really are generous about their time and the data that they may have sort of in little closed off spaces. So I'd like to turn now to Robin Turner and hear some thoughts from Robin.
So hello everyone, and I'm going to introduce myself and provide some entry points to how I think about this and raise a bunch of questions and concerns for which I mostly don't have wonderful answers, but I think are helpful to wrestle with and to talk through. So in terms of who I am, US citizen, which is relevant in terms of the passport privilege that I possessed. And I did IQMR in 2004, back when it was still in Arizona, but there was a smaller version of a field research workshop that Lauren co-led. And I'm an associate professor and department chair of political science at Butler University, which is a teaching intensive university in Indianapolis, Indiana. And I teach a range of courses that fall broadly within comparative, but also African politics, gender and sexuality politics, political economy, natural resource politics. And I used to teach our methods course, but have happily handed that off to someone else. And so also in terms of context, I am a qualitatively oriented comparativist who studies the interplay between state policies and local practices over time, and my research focuses principally on rural places and marginalized people. I've done field research in several countries, including India, Uganda, Botswana, and the United States since the late 1990s, but most of my research focuses in South Africa, which closed its borders to people who had recently been in the US March 18th. And even though it did a pretty serious lockdown, it has been badly affected by the pandemic and continues to deal with that. So I suspect, like most of you, I view social scientific research as a fundamentally relational and interactive process, which is something that Diana just spoke to. But when I think about that, what I mean is, firstly and most obviously, social scientists study people. And so political scientist describes and explains what humans do to and with one another within the domain of activities, phenomena, institutions, and structures we characterize as political. The data we work with is shaped by people all the way down. So it's people who create or destroy archival records and other documents. And archivists can facilitate or impede access to records. It's people whom we interact with both when we're physically in the field and when we're accessing it remotely, in doing participant observation, interviews, experiments, and so on. And people engage in the actions we study, such as calling elected representatives, participating in protest, or sometimes employing violence against one another. And so human decisions about documentation, communication, and participation shape all of our data, and our participants' perceptions of and inferences about their interlocutors affect the data that we generate and that we work with. In describing research as relational, I'm underscoring the ways that research connects people to one another. And again, Diana was just touching on this, but as we think about it, as researchers, we navigate many different types of relationships in the field, as we do with our families and friends and in other aspects of our work life. And these relationships can be relatively egalitarian or hierarchical, collegial or hostile, easy or more difficult. And these relationships take work and need to be tended to. So as I do research, I try to build and sustain what Leanne Fuji called a working relationship, rather than thinking solely about rapport, in which research facilitators, gatekeepers, and participants and I arrive, whether it's explicitly or implicitly, at mutually agreeable terms for interacting, conversing, listening, and talking with one another. Both my research interests, my inclinations, and my circumstances as someone who works at a teaching intensive institution have led me to do multiple field visits to the same sites over several years, and to maintain connections with some research participants and intermediaries, even as I shift to new projects. And these sorts of considerations shape how all of us do our research and would affect your field research even if it wasn't being done in the context of a global pandemic. These entry points shape how I think about field research in COVID contexts. research relationships are crucial, and they can be hard to sustain even without a pandemic. So as a US-based scholar who studies South Africa, I'm physically distant from the field most of the time, and I use a variety of modalities to maintain connections, including postal mail, email, Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, the phone, all of those sorts of things. But as I do so and attempt to tend to relationships in these ways, it really highlights the resource disparities that exist both among individual participants, but also among places. And it underscores the importance of infrastructure. So to take a concrete example, some of my research is with traditional leaders or state recognized chiefs. And if I think about 3 of the ones I work with Makotsi Dikolo Motsatsi, I can really easily communicate with her sons and daughters, but the Kosi herself doesn't use email, and postal mail in South Africa has largely collapsed, so when I send her letters and packages, they're now getting returned. In contrast, Kosi Matlaping has great coverage in his village, and so he's responsive both to WhatsApp and to email, but his community has a tourist lodge inside a game reserve that has very poor cell coverage, which means it's hard to communicate in that context. And a third Kosi I work with, Kosi Kalalelo Sadumedi, is about 50 kilometers to the south, and her village has really poor coverage, and so people will have to go stand in particular places to make phone calls or receive messages, and so she tends to communicate via WhatsApp and other means only when she's in a town or in a village. So I raise this to suggest that we really need to think about how a shift to digital engagement changes the field, and who's present in this field and in what ways, and who is absent from it, and who can participate in some places but not others, or when they have the money to purchase airtime or data, but not when they've run out. Better resourced people can serve as a bridge between researchers and research participants, but we really need to think carefully about their role, and we need to think about this in terms of archives and documents as well. So as Diana has highlighted, that in some contexts, the availability of archival digitized records may seem so abundant, it's overwhelming. It's rarely the case that everything is digitized. And so again, we need to tend to absences and gaps. And so in my context, the Northwest Provincial Archives are really important, and their staff use email and tend to be responsive, but their archives have virtually no online presence. Whereas in contrast, the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission has tons and tons of materials online and has done so for a long time. I want to remind us that we need to uphold and abide by our ethical commitments as we think about and plan for doing our research in this COVID context, where we may be working largely through a digital field rather than through physical proximity. Leon Fuji wrote, "As people deserving of dignity and respect, interviewees are entitled to ethical treatment at all times, regardless of how likable or unlikable they turn out to be." And she continued on that treating people as ends, not means, requires developing a heightened ethical sensibility that can alert the researcher to practices or strategies that might be exploiting or harming participants, assistants, and other interlocutors. She wrote this in the context of doing interpretive relational interviewing, but I think it applies beyond this context and highlights some of the issues that Lindy Toohey-Smith highlighted years earlier in decolonizing methodologies. And so we want to think about this when we think about research assistants who might be physically present in the field where we hope to generate data. And we need to think about what we're comfortable having them do and the risks that might present both to them as individuals, but also to others that they interact with. I'm, of course, coming from a context in which my research sites focus principally on marginalized people and places. And then, of course, South Africa is particularly affected by COVID. That may not be your situation. If you study up or study across, it might be the case that you confront fewer ethical conundrums in shifting to digital fields. But we also want to think if we might be generating data through internet-mediated interviews and ethnography about whether our participants have the ability to independently and privately access the technology that they need, and also about whether and how the technology that we're using protects the privacy of its users, both from hackers and from the state. I do want to note, of course, that when we think about this somewhat forced shift to the remote and to the digital, it may remind us of opportunities that we've been less attentive to. And so the previous presenters have talked about secondary sources, but I also do want to note that social media sites have been really important sites of political engagement and have helped geographically dispersed marginalized people find one another, build community, and engage in collective action. But these are very particular sorts of public spaces that are different sorts of public spaces than when you think about someone participating in a public protest, for example. And in some ways, I think of these spaces as more akin to the barbershops that Melissa Harris Perry did participant observation by proxy for Barbershops, Bibles, and BET. And we, of course, need to think about the question of the algorithm here. So some ethical considerations to think about have to do with creator expectations and about our presence and positionality and about state surveillance and repression. In terms of resources to aid our thinking and our creativity, I direct you to some of the really vibrant discussions that exist in the digital humanities, in library and information science, and in digital sociology, as well as to digital democracy, analog politics by Njala Nyabola, and to some of the work of Chipo Dindere. I want to close by highlighting the ways that this pandemic really returns our attention to power, positionality, and the ways in which it shapes our opportunities to do field research and how it constrains what we do. I'm a person who has benefited from US passport privilege throughout my passport career, and it's starting to look like those days may be gone. In my opinion, they were not ever ethically justifiable, so it may simply be a new reality that we need to negotiate. But then I also want to remind us that the pandemic is a good reminder of the breadth of the political and the ways in which politics extends well beyond the formal institutions that political science as a discipline has tended to center. And so thinking seriously about this and creatively about your fieldwork might help you identify ways to continue and pursue your research questions in a different way. And I will post a link to a few resources that come from digital humanities, from information and library sciences, and from these other fields I referenced. But I will stop now.
Thank you, Rahman. I really appreciate your comments. I think this pandemic has highlighted inequality on multiple levels, and I think we really need to think about, when we're thinking about what is possible, also really being attentive to what is being excluded, what is absent, what the gaps are, and really thinking about the ethical dilemmas that that may bring up, and that may be sort of not always surfaced, but that we really need to think and put a lot of effort into it. I want to add one additional story that sort of brings up ethical dilemmas that we experienced. I'm going to try to speak very quickly and then highlight just a couple of things for our discussion, and we'll move to the Q&A. But I wanted to talk about also when you're working with collaborators in the field, how their interests may be different and their positionality is also different, and you need to think and have very open communication about the progression of field research. We had a survey that was about to go into the field in February. We were working with 2 Canadians, 3 Americans, and 1 Kenyan scholar, and with a survey research team to do something in 3 counties in Western Kenya. And it was just days before we had already pre-tested, trained the whole team. We had sent a subset to go do the training. Everything was going to be launched in about 2 days, and we stopped, and everything got put on hold. And it was the discussions with that survey research firm. So in addition to the survey firm, we were also doing qualitative work. The discussions with the survey research firm were very important because they wanted to go forward at a point that we weren't sure. And they had a lot of interest in moving forward, and they had a certain amount of data available to them, and we had other data available to us. But one of the things that I want you to think about are when you're thinking about field work, because I believe that there will be sort of ups and downs. It's not going to be a linear progression and sort of disappearance of the pandemic, but there will be windows where you have to debate, is it safe to go in? Is it ethical to go in to this field site? You really need to think about the safety of yourself as scholars, the safety of the participants, but also the sort of, also if you're working with collaborators, their safety, how they're perceived when they're traveling perhaps to new places or interacting with new people as a group, especially now as Americans, our passport privilege is sort of reversed. And thinking about not just the sort of public health, but also the opportunity cost of what these people might need to do instead of talking to you about your research project. So what you're pulling people away from, and sort of the general environment that you're sort of engaging with. And so I think we need to think about ethics on sort of not just the informed consent level, but this much broader and ongoing interrogation of our ethical commitments. And so we had a window open again where Kenya, we were just contacted by the survey research firm to say we should go back. And we had another conversation, and it's still not possible, and it's not a good idea. And there was a lot of kind of back and forth. But again, that importance of sort of communicating and that ongoing communication. So I want to highlight a couple of questions for the discussions. I'm going to read these quickly and then open it up. So one of the questions that I had for the group is, that was really raised by Jack, is we could think about, gosh, you know, interpretive research is really predicated on these interactions and on these relational kinds of research. But is there perhaps an interpretive advantage? Like, do we have an advantage as interpretivists in this pandemic? I also want to think about what ethnography looks like. If we think about immersion, what does immersion look like in this pandemic? And thinking about what we do with an abundance of other sources, but then being attentive to what is excluded and what those absences are. thinking about our networks among scholars and how we navigate that when we also have more distance and remoteness, but we also may have some new openings and sort of generosity. And then thinking about our ethical commitments. I know when we moved to online teaching, I was really struck by digital access just within Indiana. And so thinking about what digital interface allows, but also what it disallows, what voices are possible and what are less possible. And in particular about privacy, both from the state and hackers, but also from people within people's households. So let's open up to the Q&A and see if we have some questions. Nabila, do you have anything teed up for us that you think one of our participants?
So there's a couple of questions that arguably overlap quite a bit or quite a lot. So I'm actually going to go ahead and read those questions together. The first two are related to funding and kind of grants and fellowship. So the first question of the pair is, can the panelists speak a bit about funding/grant constraints on what we can/can't do in terms of multiple trips to the field, having certain expectations from the funder on what is expected at the end, many funders skipping out on the cycle of funding? Thank you. And then the second related question is, do the panelists have any suggestions on applying to grants/fellowships this fall? How are you or would you approach applications given that fieldwork is uncertain? How can we pitch projects that may now rely on secondary sources for the next year, followed by potential fieldwork?
So do any of our panelists want to jump in? I have a couple comments on that, but Diana?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in just thinking about funding and grant proposals relating to archives, which is, so I've been doing 2 aimed for deadlines at this fall. Very pragmatically, the advice that I've gotten from program officers is to build in a contingency paragraph. So the application should look the same as any other one would, but adding a paragraph saying, if COVID interrupts travel in ways that I would not be able to travel, what would be the plan? And usually within that, I've included how I would communicate and connect with certain bibliographers, certain archivists at the archive, whose names are available on the websites. I emailed them separately and asked them, look, I'm applying for this fellowship. Would you be willing to kind of help me figure out which collections I need? That I think makes for stronger applications. In the past, when I've gotten my funding for my first project, it necessarily requires having mention of specific files and just to demonstrate a knowledge of the archives that you're looking at. I think in the larger scheme, just thinking about immersion and archival research in a way, because we rely on repositories, there's a funny way that archival research may be the least interrupted among the fieldwork options, which is not to say that it would be easy. I think for the foreseeable future, it's going to be dramatically different because even when archives open, some already have, travel is going to be disrupted. There's a disinclination to be in enclosed rooms together. And that adds up to more difficulty in just being in presence. So I think those get written into the proposals. There's recognition that that matters. For specific proposals, I would really say contact the program officer. I've written to the Library of Congress fellowship people, asking them, what do I do? And they said, we're still going to go ahead with this cycle. The deadline is going to be postponed. And you should have a paragraph saying what you're going to be doing as an alternative. So I think different fellowships have specific advice as well.
So I would agree that contacting the program officers is always a really important thing. I was always intimidated and scared to do that, but they're real human beings and they usually they're not sort of grading you on that initial phone call. They get a lot of phone calls or they get a lot of emails, and they're really, their interest is in getting better applications. So the information that they can give you will strengthen your application. And I would say generally when we're thinking about dissertation proposals or grant proposals, you want to have a contingency plan sort of in your back pocket, and now it needs to be in your front pocket. And I would say you might want to have not just a plan B, but a plan C. So a plan B where things get totally shut down and you can't do anything, and maybe there's a middle plan, or maybe there's a timing. So if things open up and I can go here, this is my initial plan, but if they don't until this point, this is my plan B, and then my plan C is completely alternative. So just a range of contingency plans can also be really helpful. Robin?
So I just wanted to add one thing to that, which may be that there are people who have ongoing grants that they're really worried about, because we've talked about sort of proposals. And here again, I think the program officer is really important. I've seen a lot of discussion about the need for grantors to allow additional time or be willing to revisit expectations given that things well beyond the grantee's control have altered the plans. But so I just wanted to say to reach out if that's your circumstance as well.
I would say
Yeah, I'll double.
Yeah, go ahead, Jack.
So I was just going to double down on that. Obviously, a different context in the UK, but the grants I hold at the moment, I've had no problem getting extensions. That's sort of been a pretty easy process. I'm not sure. I think part of that question was about getting additional funding. I suspect that funders will prefer to extend or amend expectations and outcomes rather than provide you with additional money. And I guess that's part of the idea of thinking about how then you're going to adapt your project to be able to deliver something that's good for the PhD within a smaller budget potentially, if you've already spent some of the money and now have to go back.
So I would also say that it's really important not just to communicate with your grant potential or current funders, but also with your advisors and your PhD graduate program directors, you know, communicating early and often about what your situation is and how this might impact your, you know, time to degree, I think is really, really important, because these directors are then communicating to deans about sort of extensions, not just of grants, but possibly extensions of sort of graduate funding commitments. That's not always possible given the economic hard times and austerity that a lot of these universities are feeling, but it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be communicated, that the need shouldn't be communicated. So I would say, you know, communicate with everyone. Do we have another question, Nabila?
Yes. So again, it's going to be like 2 questions because they were very similar to each other. One person writes, I think the shift to digital engagement is useful and helpful, but what about for those of us who have not necessarily developed strong relationships in our proposed field sites? How can we develop new relationships in those communities from abroad? Do you have any suggestions on how to engage with our field site digitally when we have not already traveled /live/work there? And then I, related to that, somebody else asked, how do we build trust/rapport with participants if we don't have access or time to go to the field? How do we build relationships if we've never been to our field before? We are now constrained by internet, access to phones or electricity, time zones, etc.
Robin, do you want to, you were talking a little bit about some of these issues. Do you want to?
I can say a little bit about it. I guess one thing I would say is that if I think about my first visits to places where I didn't have existing relationships, I generally had already done my best through, whether it was through secondary sources, through looking online, through looking at government documents, had tried to identify individuals, organizations, people who seemed relevant to what I was doing, and reached out to introduce myself. And this was often by email, but it could be by phone, it could be by postal mail if you're working with a place where the mail will arrive. But I think it is generally good to try to introduce yourself before you're physically somewhere, and making use of the resources that are available to try to do that, I think is important. I would be careful about trying to ask too much of people who don't yet know you, to whom you're new to, right? And this goes back to sort of the means versus ends. If people feel like you're only reaching out to them because you want to use them to get something done, that they're unlikely to be inclined to be responsive. But if they understand that you share interests and expertise, they may be interested in some sort of exchange or dialogue. It is often the case, particularly if you're connecting with local scholars who are at institutions that are under-resourced, that having access that people that are based in the global north often have to journals, to articles, to things like that, there may sometimes be things that you can provide that are helpful to the people that you're interacting with. And so then you're building a more of a reciprocal relationship.
So I think I would add to that you know, for any project, when you're going to a new field site, that you really want to, just in ordinary times, to be developing sort of a spreadsheet or a Word doc or whatever it is that works for you. You know, as you're reading, just thinking about who are the scholars in my home institution or my home country or whatever, who are working in this area, either regionally or thematically, theoretically, methodologically, and starting to get to know those scholars. So, and then sort of working your way out. So often, as Robin suggested, some of the scholars in the field site can be a really good first and then next ring of contacts. And it's not that you're necessarily going to be doing all of these interviews on Zoom, but at least sort of connecting and sort of building that social network, and really thinking about reciprocity, I think is good to think about. This is not just an instrumental way to try to open a door, but this is a way of a long-term kind of network that might be really useful for you. I don't know that you should think that Zoom interviews will just replace what you would have done in the field. I think it will be challenging to replicate what you did. So I think you're going to need to think in a different way about what the kinds of sources and the kinds of interactions, the kinds of relationships that you can build. Diana or Jack, did you have anything you wanted to add, or?
I'll try. This is such a difficult one, I think. Part of me just thinks, oh, that's too hard. And certainly when I think about my own research, a lot of it I've put on pause just because of that. And yet, so that's the negative side. The positive side, though, when I think about it a bit more carefully is, one, in a previous life, I used to be a telemarketer, so it's perfectly possible to build rapport on the telephone. In fact, it's kind of scarily possible to do so. And also, when I mean, most of my work is with elites. Invariably, when I'm recruiting, I don't really like that word, but anyway, participants, I'm always cold calling on a phone or sending a random email or trying to work through a contact or contacts to get in touch with people. So in a sense, I'm not sure that part of it is all that different. But I think the real challenge is exactly as Lauren said, the Zoom interview for elites who spend their whole life or are currently spending their whole life in these type of meetings now probably isn't too much of a stretch. But for many of the types of research communities we want to work with, it's going to be really, really difficult. But also, and this is, I think, the real reason when I think more seriously about it, why I've been a little bit reluctant to engage in this myself, is that there's something about the signal of going to the place that you're studying that demonstrates your level of seriousness about it. So I think the rapport is perhaps possible to overcome. I'm not sure how you demonstrate that level of commitment and seriousness in other ways, but I'd be very keen to hear if others have ideas about how that might be done.
So, and that may not be, that part of what we're doing in fieldwork may not be possible right now. So I will say that several people have talked about putting things on pause, but one of the things Jack talked about was not putting your writing on pause. And I really want to encourage everyone, it can be easy to sort of like literally put everything on pause. Like even taking care of yourself, taking care of your mental health, like, and just sort of going into hibernation. And I would say, like, as much as you can to keep moving and keep reading, but keep writing and try to identify something that you can write that may be a little sidebar paper or some other piece that might be really helpful to sort of get that into the publication pipeline even while you're kind of recalibrating and reimagining what your field work might look like. But I think keeping writing can really be a positive, healthy thing. Any other questions, Nabila?
The next question is, somebody asked about ethics. They say, I would appreciate if the panelists could discuss some of the ethics of desk research. Teal and Hoover Green recently published on this, but given the imperfect practices of anonymization in digital archives, or the very non-anonymized data available via social media or non-traditional archives, guidance on navigating this sort of analysis ethically would be helpful. Thanks all.
And I'm realizing that we're running short on time. So Nabila, are there any last questions that we should sort of put in our heads, and then I'll let each of the panelists take a couple of minutes to speak to whatever they want?
Yeah, there are 3 more questions. One is directed towards Diana and has like one like, so it's like cute above the others. This person asks, Diana, could you speak about the potential disadvantages of using digital archives? Many countries don't have digitized archives. Archives are tools of power in terms of what is included and excluded. And then somebody asked about, for those of us who are initiating a PhD now, in what ways will the evolving coronavirus pandemic continue to constrain fieldwork, even in the wake of a likely vaccine, potentially within the next year or so? And finally, the last question is, for those of us planning interviews that relate to political attitudes and behavior, how might we strategically discuss the fact that a pandemic is likely to condition individual attitudes in ways that may not be generalizable to other time periods?
Yeah. So these are all great comments and questions. I think given our short time that we're really about to go over, I'm sorry, I just, that always happens. I think I'll go in the order that they presented and ask Jack and then Diana and Robin if they have anything they want to speak to from all of those questions. So maybe just a minute or so each, if that's okay. Sorry. So Jack.
Can we come back to me? I need to have a little think.
Jack is thinking. Diana, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm happy to go.
Okay.
Just one point building on the comment of Lauren, as you mentioned, staying busy or staying occupied. I so second that. And I think this sounds banal, but sending a ton of emails has also been one way that I've been coping with discontinued access. I go through waves. There are days when I have a lot of energy and it feels like I can do things. And there are days when the pandemic and everything just feels so disorienting, I can't do anything. So I seize on certain days. The emails that I've been sending have been to other historians who've used archives that I need, and to special collections holders, the chief archivists or bibliographers at different institutions. And one thing that I found really interesting was, so the OSU had a paper, a 1957 survey from Japan that I really wanted to see. I didn't know they held it. I found it somehow online. And I asked them very politely, very long email, being like, whenever the archives reopen, can you help me digitize these? Would you be willing to help out? And I was both very gratified by how kind they were in answering immediately, being like, yes, absolutely, we'll do it. And also mentioning that we have a backlog of about 2 months because people have been constantly asking us if they can do these little digitization bits for us. And so it reminded me that research continues to move on. And as you find moments where you can collect little bits here and there, that is also a way to make progress, even if the kind of physical presence in your field sites are disrupted. So that, and then just very briefly on the disadvantages of digital archives, which I think relates to the ethics as well. I think it disturbs me profoundly when I think about a year from now, given how much digitized archives will, I think, become a huge norm for archival research, that there will be black spots, especially in countries that cannot fully digitize their archives, that lack the resources, and that will be the terrain on which we work. Plus, the digitized collections are always curated, and so we're less attentive to the sort of insidious management and disclosure of information that looks totally objective, all the more so when it's on a website, less so than we see it in the physical archives. It keeps me up at night. One thing that helps me go to sleep a little bit is, and this is also a call for more interdisciplinarity, I tend to look at what historians in specific historiographical traditions have been doing about their understudied archives and different repositories. In a lot of ways, we're not seeing anything new. We're seeing inequalities aggravated. And I like to build on the work that, for instance, the Cambodia archives, which are so dear to my heart, are under-digitized. There have been wonderful historians who've been pointing this out for a long time and figuring out ways to collect information and create images. So I'm in touch with them. And I think that's a small way that we as researchers can also not counter, but at least be mindful of the inequality of privileges that are going to shape digital archives for the foreseeable future.
That was really helpful, Diana. Thank you so much. Robin or Jack? I don't want to press anyone.
I can say a couple of things. One on the ethics of desk research. I think a site is going to get added to the Q&A and it'll get sent afterwards. But Kate Cronin-Furman has done interesting work sort of thinking of the ethics of violence research that I think, again, if you're not, even if you're not a violence researcher, can help us sort of wrestle with these questions. The other thing I wanted to do is note that when we think about turning to the digital, it's not only archives that are sources of data that we might include in our research. And so if I think about, say, legislators are sometimes putting things online, their government gazettes, their court decisions. Now there are processes that are being live streamed that weren't being live streamed before, and this is in the global south as well as in the global north. And there are NGOs and others in country places that are sort of very actively engaging in ways that can help you remain connected to your questions and get a sense of how the discussion is moving in those sites. And then the last thing I'll note, in terms of thinking at archives and absence and exclusion, particularly within Black studies, there's all sorts of really important work, both by people within Afghan studies or African diaspora studies and in history, about working against the grain and engaging with the unevenness and exclusion of archives that I think we as political scientists might learn from.
Thank you, Rahman. I just want to highlight, though, I think it's really, in terms of working against the grain, I think it's really important to think through and try to anticipate, if you're working in the digital space, what voices are being sort of accentuated. For my recent project, I've been working on the electricity crisis in Ghana. And a lot of what I had access to before going to the field was through social media, and looking at the social media commentary and the hashtag protests and the actual protests that were organized through social media. It was very much an urban phenomenon. And there was a perspective that this was really based in the large urban cities in Ghana, and that's where the sort of suffering was experienced. And it was only by going to the field and insisting on doing interviews in smaller rural communities that I realized, in some sense, the suffering experienced in the rural areas were sort of more absolute, and in terms of their access to any kind of electricity, but their voices weren't heard on the same platforms. And so we in terms of racial and ethnic groups, in terms of age, like who's participating in these different platforms, in terms of socioeconomic status. So it won't be perfect, but I think at least if we can think about what we are doing and what we're highlighting, I think that's a really important part of it. Jack?
I'll be quick, couple of points over time. I guess everyone's mentioned this issue of momentum, but I think it's so important with a PhD. So if you have to pause one part, definitely don't pause the whole thing. There's lots of things that be going on with. It's much easier to unpause something that is still rolling rather than to start something new again. Lauren raised a point earlier about immersion, and I was thinking about that, and I often wonder, in fact, I think I am more inclined to this view, that one of the things we really do as an academic is immerse ourselves in the literature. And it's the literature that we're contributing to, and it's the literature that our empirical work makes sense in. And so even if we can't be immersing ourselves in the field, I think we can definitely be immersing ourselves in the literature. And that's something that I've really enjoyed actually a little bit in the last few months, is being able to read more than I would normally would. Having said that, I really liked the point earlier about windows, that we will be able to get back to the field. There's a question there about the sort of thinking about starting the PhD or at the beginning of the PhD and how to plan for doing field work. I think we will get windows. I'm hoping so. Certainly that's my plan, is to wait for the windows. I'm not sure how they're going to work, but I'm optimistic, maybe naively so. But I think keeping our eye out for these windows is going to be really key over the next few years. And then there's a final question there about generalizability, which I'm not, if I understand that correctly, I guess I can see how that would be a real problem, particularly if you're working in the more naturalist or positivistic type of research tradition. I think in an interpretive tradition, we wouldn't expect, or we wouldn't be trying to control for our research response being altered or biased or anything by a change in circumstance. So I'm not sure that I can advise how to address that in a more naturalist tradition, but in an interpretive tradition, I think I would be saying, yeah, that's how it works.
So, and I do think that we do have to be mindful of how this context is global, And this is shaping everyone who's doing research and everyone who's living like all over the world. And so we do have to be thinking about, you know, for the questions that we're asking, what does this environment mean for the ways, you know, I have a project on political participation. What does this mean for understanding political participation? So I would agree with Jack, yes, you need to think about what are the limits. I guess I don't concern myself with generalizability. My aim is not generalizability, and I sort of think about it in the reverse, like how are the contexts shaping the ways that people are understanding what's happening and how they're participating in politics. I think we have gone over time. We are delighted to still have most of our attendees with us. But I wanted to again thank all of our panelists for joining us today, and Nabila for helping us to moderate our questions and answers. This recording will be posted. And I think we'll have some other resources and links that will be shared with everyone. Very grateful to IQMR for putting this on, and I encourage you to stay in touch with IQMR and come back for other webinars and other events. But thanks to everyone, and I hope everyone has a fabulous day, and we all keep managing and finding those silver linings where we can, and keep working and doing our best. So thank you.